All right, here we are with Yat Siu, co-founder and chairman of Animoca Brands, a Web3 gaming giant, which also has education and investment arms. Yat, it's so great to have you here on the Defiant podcast. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So you've really been at the forefront of some of the biggest trends in Web3 and crypto with gaming, NFTs, Web3 Social. So I would love to dive into all of these topics in this conversation. But to start, it would be great if you can provide background on Animoca Brands itself. Like, what is this giant doing right now, and also how what led you to start the company?
Sure. I mean, I think Animoca Brands is probably most known for our activity in, I guess, Web3 gaming. Although actually, as a company, I think we're much more than that. We're also probably known to be an investor, but again, very different from a traditional VC because we actually invest mostly out of our balance sheet. So we don't have a fund in the classical sense. And today we have done over 450 investments in the space. We're probably known for investments like back in the days when it was like Dapper Labs or like Decentralized or like Polygon, right back in the early days. And then, of course, IMX and so on, or for the acquisition of Sandbox, which became one of our subsidiaries, for instance. Right. So today we have, many subsidiaries, basically that operate in Web3, building games, metaverses, and I guess platforms like what we do with Mocaverse, with Moca ID and sort of identity solutions. And then, of course, in the investment side of the 450 investments, over 150 are gaming investments. I think, for instance, Axie Infinity was, one that we led the round early in the day. And of course, with Ronin, the blockchain. And of course, most recently, Pixels, which I think is the biggest Web3 game today. That's also one of them that we led the round and helped launch and so forth. So we've been in the space for a while. And I think the way that we got into it was actually through CryptoKitties, right? Our studio in Vancouver actually helped co-construct, I guess, CryptoKitties somewhat. And the founder of our studio in Vancouver ended up becoming a co-founder of Dapper Labs. And that's actually what led us into the NFT space. And that's actually how we actually saw the potential of that. And so the whole idea of the fact that, content can become a platform, and the fact that we can actually sort of have ownership, true ownership of our digital assets as a video game studio, which is originally what we were, was kind of like a dream come true for us because it was kind of a fantasy that we all lived for a while. And we created abstractions of the ability to have quasi-ownership, but always within the confines of what the game studios set for us. And then we discovered actually with NFTs, you had true freedom on these assets. And that's kind of what attracted us to that. So that's how we got into the space. That was late 2017. And when we saw that, we decided, we thought that was the future and gaming would lead the charge. That was certainly our belief. And, culture would perhaps be the most important way in which we onboard people, the masses, into Web3. And so that's why we decided to make all these investments. And then that was actually in 2018 and 2019 when we acquired the Sandbox, when we invested in Decentralized, when we sort of did the deal with Dapper Labs, when we worked with Polygon, when we sort of invested in Axie, OpenSea, all those, companies that today, but back in 2018, 2019, nobody knew who they were, right? I mean, we were all anomalies. So that's our start, and that's how we got started. And our mission really is to deliver true digital property rights. That's generally speaking, our cause, shall we say.
So originally you had a video gaming studio, and that helped spawn CryptoKitties. And so seeing the rise of CryptoKitties, that kind of was your aha moment of NFTs and realizing, wow, you can have actual ownership of digital assets thanks to blockchain.
That's right. And I think one of the things that really fascinated us wasn't just the idea that we had the ability to have digital ownership. That's obviously the power of it, but also that the control, as in the supply of the kitties, was actually up to the community. So really, in some ways, for the first time ever, really, the entire economical framework, this is before fungible tokens, right? This is just in terms of NFTs. The entire economical framework, the supply and demand, was actually sort of governed entirely by the community. And I remember, we did the HTC deal where, there was actually, even before the Solana phone, we actually had a blockchain phone that was done together with HTC and Dapper Labs, basically with bundling with CryptoKitties. And I remember having this conversation with HTC, and they were like, "Okay, so how many kitties do we need so we can breed cats?" I said, "You need 2." "Okay, no problem. So can you just give us cats?" And we're like, "Yeah, but at the time that would cost you about $15 to $20 for a pair of cats." And they were like, "Well, why do I have to pay for that?" "Well, because we don't own those cats. We have to buy them from the community, right?" And I think for them it was sounded almost ridiculous at the time, but they understood. But to me, that actually was, the real power, because it was truly representing this idea that the community owned it, and we had to work with the community to get it, and we had to buy the supply from the community itself, and that's how value was shared, and that's how they became a part of everything that we were building, and that was kind of the vision behind that. Yeah.
And then you went on to invest on some of the projects, the platforms that really became the leaders in the space later on. You mentioned some Sandbox, Axie. How do you decide when to invest in a team and project?
Well, okay. So to be fair, in 2018, 2019, there weren't that many projects to invest.
You just invested in all of them.
We didn't invest in all of them, but I think the main point simply being was, of course, we had to share in the values, right, and we had to share the ethos. And for us, the main ethos of Web3 was, and this is actually a motto that we have at Animoca Brands, is sort of sharing the network effect, right? So in other words, when we think about the essence of Web3, one of the sort of key values is that we're building in a shared network. That means that we share in its values, whether it's share royalties, whether it's sharing, paying gas, whether it's giving to the community, whether you do airdrop. It doesn't really matter what it is that you do, but the point is that you have to share with your network, as in with your community, which in some ways is a pretty alien concept in Web2, but it's a very natural concept in Web3. So as long as you shared in those values, and you had sort of a common belief, we would try to back you. Because I remember back in the days, I think the very first NFT conference that was of any kind of size was in Hong Kong, right? And it was called Nifty. And in fact, it was actually sort of co-sponsored by Decentralized at the time. It was in Hong Kong at the Cyberport, which is basically where our office is. And I think there was maybe 200 people in the entire conference. It was really small. And, I was giving a talk. In fact, that's kind of my first talk was Content as a Platform back then in 2018, early 2018 at that conference. And I think there was maybe 20 people in the room, right? It was pretty empty, right? But I think, then we had side meetings. And, all those people, we kind of were drinking our own Kool-Aid, of course. And for those who might remember, 2018 and 2019 was a real crypto winter. I mean, the crypto winter of the last 12 to 18 months was tough. But it was nothing, I think, compared to how it was in 2018, 2019. Bitcoin was I think $3,000 or less. Ethereum actually at one point dipped below 100. It was pretty depressing times, right? And so the small group of people who were building in the space, all of us were true believers. Because if you were willing to build about NFTs in 2018, 2019, you're pretty hardcore, right? So I think in that sense, it was pretty easy to make these investments. Also because they weren't very expensive, right? I mean, Axie Infinity or Sky Mavis, their valuation at that time was below 10 million, for instance, right? And the valuation in OpenSea was below 20 million. I mean, we acquired the Sandbox for, I think, 4.7 billion. I mean, those were the deals back in the day. So, even though they were very large bets for us at the time, in a relative scale of things, it wasn't that expensive. And we also shared in this common belief about the future of, I guess it was really blockchain and NFTs, because the term Web3 hadn't really taken off at that moment in time, right? So we didn't even call it Web3. That happened actually maybe 2 or 3 years later, right? So that's really how it started. And then today, when we accelerated our investments, we have the same ethos in terms of thinking about shared network effects. And of course, when we're building and when we're sort of investing, we also look at their capabilities and we look at their skills, right? Because today there's a lot more people that are sort of, Web3 native, that understand smart contracts. Whereas in 2018, 2019, many of them were still learning in the space. It was literally we're all beginners together, so to speak, right? Whereas I think now it's a little bit easier to see those companies that understand, the nature of Web3 much better. You've
talked about Animoca Brands investment side. I'd love to hear about what you are, what products, what games you're building now?
Well, I mean, I think it's, obviously Sandbox continues to be a key strategic initiative, but otherwise, one of the other initiatives that, we're really focused on is the Mocaverse. And while the Mocaverse in and of itself isn't the game, it's a distribution platform initially for games. For instance, when Pixels basically was sort of trying to bring in users, Mocaverse helped them bring in about a third of its traffic, right? With Mocaverse and eventually Moca ID, right? And that's, it's represented through our NFT collection, which you can sort of, on Ethereum, but also now, basically with Moca ID, which I think we have over 1 million users at this moment in time, we now have the ability to sort of direct traffic into different sort of Web3 games. So you can think of Mocaverse kind of like a decentralized Steam. And, it started off really back in the day when we were doing KYC for many of our users, because sometimes these assets can become quite valuable, and therefore we wanted to make sure that we could do that. But then we found out that, many of those wallets are sometimes sold, right? The identity itself is not something that was actually truly theirs, because they would just re-KYC and then sell those accounts. That's the first one. And then the second issue, of course, is that we needed to find a way in which we could actually have reputation transfer from one game to the other. And that's hard to do when you keep having a new wallet, right? And so this is kind of where a soul-bound NFT as your sort of identity layer for your reputation starts to make sense. Because how do I know, for instance, that you're a gamer that likes RPGs, or that likes first-person shooters, or that likes games like, I don't know, Axie or Pixels? Like, how can I target you? How can I offer you something valuable, right? Because in Web3, the way that you market to users is that you basically give benefits to the users directly, right? You don't need an intermediary in that sense. But to do that, I need to understand what your interest is. And unlike Web2, where a gatekeeper directs it for you and takes a fee for that, and often misdirects, I would argue, in Web3, actually, it's really up to the end user to signal what he or she would like to see, right? For instance, if I buy a Bored Ape, I'm saying something about myself, and therefore I'm attracting a certain kind of product to come my way, right? And in gaming, it's the same. But right now, there's no good way, until Mocaverse, to target a gamer that can say what his interest is outside of owning an NFT. Like, I don't know what level you are. I don't know what your real interest is. I don't know how committed you are. But based on that reputation you're building in Web3, I can probably earn a bigger airdrop, or I can earn a certain benefit. I mean, for instance, in traditional gaming, if I could target, the biggest spenders in, Fortnite, for instance, I would probably pay more money for them directly to them. And as an end user, I would appreciate that, because my sort of commitment to one game can be rewarded in another game. And, while in Web2, that kind of vampire attack would be considered quite hostile, actually in Web3, it can become quite complementary, because it offers more value to the original game or original NFT collection, because it gives benefits. Like if you have a Bored Ape, for instance, or Land in Sandbox, you sometimes get a lot of gifts because you're a good target, because you have sort of valuable items and assets. And that's actually better for the entire ownership of that collective as well. Right, so that's an example there. And of course, the other areas outside of the gaming, like Rev, which is a sort of motorsports ecosystem, and then Phantom Galaxies, which is sort of space related games, which are kind of AAA in quality. We also have an emphasis in, I guess, gamified education, which is what we do with TinyTap and Open Campus, which we're quite excited about as well.
Protocol 20 introduces Sorbonne, which is Stellar's cutting-edge smart contracts platform. This creates new surface area for innovation and provides new opportunities for developers to build protocols and products that create access to everyday financial services. So it means a gradual increase in transaction capacity and a chance to fine-tune applications. And it's the most transformative upgrade to the Stellar network to date. Woohoo!
To recap on Mocaverse, on digital identity, soul-bound NFTs, how does it work? You distribute soul-bound NFTs to a network of users of Web3 games, and then those gamers, as they build their reputation on chain, are able to then. I mean, they get rewarded by different players.
Yes. So what happens is I guess you can think of it as one of a few ways, right? Mm-hmm. So the first one is that we think of Mocaverse users, whether it's Moca ID, which is the soulbound NFT that you can sort of claim for the time being for free, or get it from a sort of Mocaverse NFT holder because they're basically given a sort of, passes which they can pass on to their friends. So that's one way in which you get the ID. And then the other one, of course, as you play these games, you build a reputation. You can earn potentially airdrops from that game because that's their incentive mechanism. Because these gamers, they build traffic, they build network effects. And, one common misunderstanding in, the traditional world of gaming is that most gamers don't pay any money in the freemium business model.
Don't what, sorry?
Most gamers don't pay money.
Okay.
In Web 2, right? The industry average is actually 1.8%, as in 1.8% of all gamers pay. But those 1.8% actually are responsible for an industry that is worth $200 billion a year. And so what happens is that actually the people who don't pay, they actually become the entertainment for the people who pay. So imagine, for instance, if you go into Fortnite or if you go into, whatever game, and there's nobody to play or compete with, well, you're not going to pay any money, right? So the people who play for free, actually, we think of it as they're working for the game. And depending on how you play, you actually might make someone pay money at that moment in time. Now, in the Web3 model, when people talk about play to earn, and some people were very critical about that, what they didn't really understand is that actually play to earn is just one mechanism of ownership in which you can now calculate the value that a free gamer made to create revenue for the game itself, right? And so that's sort of an example of how that business model sort of works in that environment.
And so how do the games themselves benefit from that?
Well, they get traffic. So, I mean, let me put it in a Web 2 context. Why do you launch an app on the App Store? Because the App Store has lots of users. Why do you put an app on Google Play or on Steam? Because you can discover a lot of gamers. I mean, that's basically the high level point here. That's the reason you do that. And in the case of Mocaverse, we see that essentially as, a gamer base that loves to play games and also is able to, play test, which allows you to find bugs or it allows you to create other forms of value. And of course, when you reward these gamers for that activity, actually the likelihood of them buying other stuff or reinvesting in terms of the game, the time and money into the game is much, much higher if they like it, right? So that is actually sort of part of the value there as well. And they also, they create these network effects, right? How do again, maybe I could give you a Web 2 example. Last year in sort of game advertising in Web 2, the industry spent $100 billion, a bit more than $100 billion in advertising to promote their games in like CPA, CPI type of ads. But the difference in Web 2 is that they advertise on Google, Facebook, Apple and so on. How much of that money do you think goes back into the gaming industry? Almost nothing. Yeah, not because Apple or Facebook or Google, they don't really invest in games. They don't give benefits to gamers. Now imagine if you take that money to advertise for the game, but you give it to gamers instead, whether you call it an airdrop or whether you call it a free NFT, it doesn't really matter. You're actually spending marketing dollars, the same marketing dollars, but you're giving it to the gamer. There is an infinite higher value, a chance, if effectively, of that money going back into the gaming ecosystem. And even if, and this is the thing about the shared network, even if they don't put that money into your game, they'll put it into another game because they're actually gamers, right? So this is the whole point, right? Web3 is just a healthy ecosystem that way because the money that is given to them isn't extracted to a company that takes it from you and then really doesn't do anything and doesn't give back into the ecosystem. And I think, to me, I find it, for instance, ridiculous that Apple doesn't have an ecosystem fund and that they don't invest in, companies that make apps or make games, for instance, because they don't think this way, right? But in Web3, it's very natural to do this. And the gamers themselves get rewarded for this activity. And of course, they sort of then put money back into the gaming ecosystem, not just for entertainment, but also because for goodwill or for social reasons, whatever that might be.
Super interesting. So you've mentioned the term or the concept content as a platform a couple of times.
Yes.
I'd love for you to explain exactly what you mean by that.
Well, so when we say content as a platform, it starts with the principle of property rights. And in the virtual world or the digital world, until blockchain, that wasn't really possible. Because when we think of our physical ownership of things, they are platforms today. So for instance, we think of the ownership of cars as a platform. If you own a car, you can hire a driver, you can have someone give you leather seats, you can have people give you places to park your car. There could be Uber, there could be Lyft. Think of all the businesses that have been created today just because millions of people own cars. So the ownership of cars is a platform, and it's permissionless, right? I mean, I can buy a car from anyone in the world. I don't need to go to an official dealer only. I could buy a secondhand car from my friend, for instance, because it's his car. He has those rights to do that. And they can decorate it, and they create baby seats. Like baby seats is my favorite example because, back when the baby seat was invented in the 30s, actually, all the car companies back then were like, why do you need a baby seat? Like, you don't need that, right? But someone said, well, I want to drive my family safely in a car. And they created and invented that. And then, of course, baby seats are now so important. It became a major industry, and also somewhat contributed to the need for seat belts and all that kind of stuff, right? New innovations happened, right? That's what we mean in terms of a platform. Ownership of cars is a platform. Ownership of your house is a platform. Ownership of watches is a platform. Ownership of Pokemon cards is a platform, right? People build businesses on top of things we own. But in the digital world, up until blockchain, you couldn't do that before because you never owned the asset. For instance, when you think about skins in Fortnite, right, which is, the decorative items that you can sort of buy, you need permission from Epic to be able to do anything. It's not yours. So it's not a platform. It is just content. But in Web3, what happens is that content becomes an asset, right? So the CryptoKitty, which is a funny cat, actually is an asset, which means it can now become a platform, like owning a car or owning a house. If you own a Bored Ape, it is content, but it is now also an asset. And because I own a Bored Ape, someone will give me an airdrop, whether this is ApeCoin or whether this is something else, right? Or they'll make a game for me because they want me as a customer. So that's what it means when I say as a platform. And of course, the difference, in Web3 is that we now have the sort of opportunity to sort of aggregate as a network these platform effects. Because if you own a Bored Ape and I own a Bored Ape, or you own a Mocaverse and I own a Mocaverse, if one of the Mocaverse products becomes successful, we all benefit, right? So again, we share in the network effect. I think that's what we meant. And so the element, of course, only is possible if we have property rights. And I think, we can now, with Mocha ID, we're thinking one step further, which is actually you have content as a platform, but actually we as individuals are platforms as well. And then that's actually the social element, which is, again, a version of this. Because when you think about our activity in social networks, right, actually we are platforms. Whether you have 1 million followers, 100,000 followers, or 10 followers on Instagram, for instance, actually you're a platform. Even in your social circle, just think about in the course of a week with your friends, whether it's you or your mom or your parents or your friends, how many times did they recommend a restaurant? How many times did they recommend a movie that you would watch? How many times did they make suggestions to you where they influenced to make a decision? Not because they want to make money from it, just because they were sharing that they thought were good ideas. So in a way, we're all platforms of our own, right? And I think this, to me, is the real power of basically what we mean by sort of this decentralized ownership, because now we all become owners of our own platforms, as opposed to having to rent the spaces of companies like Meta/Facebook or Google or Apple and so on, and then have to pay a very extractive fee, which, by the way, they can always take away from us, right? I think that's, that again is why we love Web3 so much.
Amazing. I think that's a great way to seg into Web3 Social, which is a topic I wanted to talk to you about. So this concept of content as a platform and of individuals as a platform connects really well with the Web2 social media model, right? Because Web2 social media has been monetizing individuals by collecting thousands of data points about on them, and then aggregating them and selling them to advertisers, and keeping all of those gains from our own data without passing them on to us. in exchange for us using these services, these sites for free. But I think people are increasingly realizing that actually that wasn't free, that we were giving away something extremely valuable, which is all of our information, basically.
Absolutely.
So in this new model for social media, with hopefully blockchain and crypto as the infrastructure for it, what does the new business model look like? Because, okay, so in essence, individuals in this new system, they will own their own information and data. And then maybe there's a token involved, so they also earn or own a fraction of these platforms that they're using. But then, if you can kind of help complete that picture, like how does that ecosystem work? How is it sustainable? How do these platforms make money in the end to like pay developers to keep sustaining them?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, obviously, everything is work in progress. But we have, in our mind, a pretty clear high-level concept how this works, which is how when we launch products and games, we think about token designs and we think about NFTs in that context. But first to sort of address your first point, I mean, as you rightly pointed out, nothing is ever truly free. You think it's free, but in reality, they extract a high tax. And a lot of it comes from the fact that you don't know what the value is. And that's because, pre-blockchain, the transactional value of these platforms were secret to us. Like, in other words, if you have 10,000 followers on Instagram, you don't actually know what it's worth. They don't tell you that because I actually don't know who they are. I might know a few hundred of those followers, but I don't know every follower that's out there. I don't know what they trade. I don't know what's in their wallet. I don't know how much money they have. I don't know anything about them, right? And so as a result of that, they actually keep us ignorant. And by the way, that's kind of the origin of the early internet. Actually, what the early internet did was it actually made transparent broad information. And so suddenly, not only do I have knowledge of the encyclopedia now available for free, I also knew what the value of my goods were that I was selling. For instance, if I'm a sort of a rice farmer in China, I now knew what the price was in America, which they were charging maybe sometimes 30, 40, 50x of what they bought it for. And the internet, the first version, the Web 1, showed me that price. And then I was like, oh, hold on a second, I actually want more money. And here's the powerful thing. If essentially, and this is what I think will happen in, SocialFi, as it were, if someone actually is not willing to pay me my fair share, someone else will come in and say, you know what? Okay, he won't pay you the 50%, but I will pay you 50%, or I will pay you 60%, or I will pay you 70%. It becomes a market, right? And an actual market because you actually have transparency. In Web 2, they created a little trick. It's called likes. Right? Likes were essentially a way in which they fooled us into thinking as a kind of social currency, if you will, right? But the value was abstracted because we can safely say that maybe a like from you is more valuable than a like from me, perhaps, for instance, right? Because maybe you have more influence, right? And so your value is more, but I don't know what that is. But if you put that into a token economy, you're actually able to enumerate that value. You're able to analyze it. Right? And that actually is how these network effects form. And so it comes down to the next part, which is what is actually valuable in these social networks or anything that we do online. While it's data that we generate, what data actually creates, the derivative of that is knowledge. And that knowledge becomes network effects. And that's what's really valuable. So the network effects embedded is actually what's powerful in all this. The problem is that, up until blockchain, we didn't have a public way in which you could analyze what the value of these network effects were. We didn't know what they are, and therefore we couldn't value it, and therefore we were happily giving it away. But in the sort of SocialFi context, if you will, right, or in sort of Web3 Social, however you want to define it, actually we're now able to enumerate these network effects. And to me, tokens are one way, a very powerful way in which we can create sort of an analysis on these network effects, because essentially they create a market for the value of the network. Right? I think a lot of people sometimes think of tokens as currency. It can be, but we like to think of tokens really as proxies for network effects. So for instance, when you have an Ethereum token, we don't think of it as a currency. We think of it as a representation of the network, because you can't look at Ethereum as, or any blockchain or any L1, L2 as an example, or even in a game. You can't look at that in the context of classic money. because, you know, the amount of gas that Ethereum generates is not a proxy to its value. What's actually valuable is, you know, how many people are building on it, what's the size of the economy, what's the GDP equivalent of, I guess, this blockchain or that blockchain, for instance. And that's actually a proxy for the network effect. And therefore, the token is a representation of that. And you can own a piece of that because tokens are multifaceted, right? They don't have one dimension. They have multi-dimensions because they're programmable and because they have, you know, these network effects that you can enumerate. So that's kind of how we think of that. So when you think of the question on social, right, you know, the network effects inherent actually become sort of the token itself, right? And we think in some ways, you know, we think that, you know, when we go to the topic of things like meme coins, right? You know, I think meme coins are not just funny and sort of whimsical, they're cultural representations of the networks that we're building. Nobody said, by the way, that these networks had to last. Nobody said that these networks were permanent. I would argue that when Gucci or Hermes or any one of these brands built a brand, what were they really building? I would say they were building a network, right? And that network is their brand. And when you now see that brand, it means something to you, a cultural context, something powerful, a feeling that you have. And that comes from all the things that they helped build. And so I now want to own this bag, or I want to own this car, or I want to own this watch because it represents the power of that network, whether it's direct or indirect. Right? I mean, nobody buys a Rolex watch to tell the time, right? It's actually completely a signal of your social network, which is really representing a signal of your, I guess, network that you want to join. And the value of the Rolex is representative of that network. And so I think of, you know, tokens or NFTs in a similar fashion. The more network effects you have in your token, or the more network effects you have in your NFT, represents essentially the power and the value of that, whether it's financial or not. Sometimes it doesn't be financial, but it's still powerful and valuable for you in one way or the other, right? So, and unlike in Web 2, in Web 3, we can also analyze. So, you know, the liquidity and the speed in which you see transactions give you an idea of what those network effects look like. So when people trade, you know, basically land in Sandbox, or whether they trade a Mocaverse or Bored Ape or Cool Cat, right? I can actually quickly analyze how liquid is it, how real is it, and automatically I understand, you know, what some information, which is what markets do, right? Markets give us information. You know, the other thing when we talk about the shared network, just to sort of dwell on this a little bit, is in Web 2, the network effects are in walled gardens. So, you know, Facebook or TikTok or Twitter or Google or Microsoft, they're all islands of network effects, right? They don't talk to each other. And so while they have power, you know, I mean, Apple is worth $2.7 trillion. Facebook is worth $1.3 trillion. I mean, that to me is a representation of the value of those networks. But in Web 3, actually what happens is that there is no such thing as a walled garden network. I mean, unless you're running, you know, like a Hyperledger sort of, you know, enterprise blockchain. But generally speaking, right, the kind of blockchains we care about are public and they bridge together. And I think what you see different from 21, 22 to what we see now in this era is, you know, basically all the blockchains sort of really bridging together and actually sharing liquidity and creating joint network effects. And now as a result, you know, it's like the intermingling and the power of what we see today and the growth potential becomes exponential because now we have network effects that can compound on top of each other. I mean, just imagine if the data and the networks of, let's say, Google and Facebook and Apple and Microsoft all merged together as a thought experiment. What would actually happen? It would be an explosion of network effects and value, which of course today isn't possible and won't be possible, but in Web3 it can be. Which is also why Web3 sort of networks are inherently much, much more valuable than any Web2 network for that reason.
Hey everyone, I'm Ilya, and I'm inviting everyone to Bangkok, November 9 to 11.
You've been duped into thinking anything decentralized was ever gonna work. There's a better way. Stop wasting your time with all this blockchain and go back to the norm. Get a latte and stop trying to change the world. Oh, and this thing in November, Redacted, the hackathon, they're cushy office jobs out there, you know? Everything is working as it should.
For our special event, Redacted. We're gonna dive into AI, we're gonna dive into Web3, chain abstraction, decentralization, and user-owned AI. I'll see you there.
So to kind of ground that argument of the token being a representation of the network and how these networks are open and shared. And so the potential for a value to grow is much larger because it encompasses the entire world, like the entire population that can be, and all of that data can be open and leveraged by all these different platforms. But so to bring back to the question of kind of what the actual business model is, it's like when you have a specific token linked to a specific SocialFi protocol or dApp, for example, the idea is that that token will be used in some way within that network, and then that token will gain in value, and the token itself will become the way that the app is sustainable.
Yes.
The growing token treasury will pay for developers and
yeah,
so
no.
on.
So we have a different view on token treasuries and tokens broadly speaking, maybe from that perspective, because we actually think the revenue that a platform should generate comes from the transaction fees, or essentially the trading fees that happen from that, right? Okay. So in other words, we don't think that selling tokens into the market is, first of all, it's not sustainable long, it's sort of, mid to long term. And two, that's actually not how it should function, because we think of tokens, our mental model of a token is a liability, right? We don't think of tokens as revenue. That's something, but we think of transaction fees as revenue, right? We think of services are given as revenue, right? So when you do that distinction, then it should be fairly clear what your business model should be, right? Which is why, for instance, when we sort of, issued NFTs like Mocaverse, today they're worth 4 ETH, but actually at the time, it was literally a free mint almost, right? And so we don't make money from the fact that it was a free mint, right? Our community makes value from that, right? But actually we make money from the transactions that take place, kind of like a tax, right? So when you think of it a little bit like a country, right? Which often we give that example. We think the Metaverse and L1, L2 blockchains are like nations, right? They function similarly. It's like, we compare it to GDPs, for instance. You don't make money as a government because you will sort of constantly be selling new real estate. But you do make money from taxing the value of the transaction of that real estate. And the people who are creating that value are the end users who made value, because whether they traded, whether they designed it, whether they renovated it, right, they contributed to that network. Because again, we exist in a shared network. I go back to that principle, right? How do we share value in that construct, right? So we function in a way where we are in the market. Like we think, for instance, whether you're a metaverse or whether you're an L1, L2 blockchain, it's important that you are actually sort of participating it in a way that you can sort of partake in the fees of this, right? Whether this is royalties with NFTs or whether this is transaction fees or whatever that is, that to us is the sustainable mechanism. And tokens have high liquidity, right, as a result. I mean, I think the current volume, of course, it changes every day, but I think volume in the last 24 hours, exceeded $100 billion, right? So, depending on how many projects sort of are in your ecosystem and how many tokens you're managing, there's a high degree of, I guess, a yield and the transaction fees you could be generating from that, for instance, right? So I think again, that to us is the sort of long-term, actually sustainable model. And of course, you can sell NFTs and you can sell tokens. That's okay, right? But I think you can't build a business on that because most token designs have also a fixed token supply, right? And so the fixed token supply there's a problem when you sell all your tokens, and basically, then what do you do, right? And then inadvertently, you end up having to issue another token, which basically means you devalue your own token, which is what happens in Web2 gaming all the time. So that model doesn't work, right? And when the game has sustainability in terms of usage, what really happens is that they use the token in the game for the content, and then basically the content, those tokens come back to the treasury, and then you sell them back into circulation. Again, there's transaction fees that are generated from that activity, right? So that's generally the model that we think is much more sustainable and really should be the model for Web2 gaming or Web3 gaming or Web3 anything.
That's super. Yeah, that really interesting. So the idea is that instead of us as users being the product, and the model is selling our data for advertisers, In Web3, what you're arguing is that these networks will have native tokens, and the activity that happens in that network happens via transactions, and then the network itself takes a fee, like a tax, from those transactions, and that's how they generate revenue, while the user is able to, retain their own privacy, their own data, and use that in whatever way they want. And it's also, because it's an open system, no one platform will be the owner of that data.
Correct. And I think, in Web 2, actually that transactional system already exists. It's just that the Web 2 user doesn't know it, because the company that's offering the service is taking your data and is paying Amazon or Azure or some kind of web hosting service provider for those transactions. So you never know what that costs, right? But actually you're paying for it in forms of surrendering your data and the value of those network effects, right? The data itself isn't what's valuable. It's a network effects that this data creates that is so powerful and valuable. And of course, the thing about data is that it compounds, right? So if you add more data on top of other data and mix it with more data, it becomes even more valuable, right? And that's actually the part that ought to be shared with the end user. And, I think it's totally fair that an end user, because he doesn't have the ability to make that value out of the data, that he might not receive, maybe even the majority of that value. Maybe it's 20%, 30%. It depends on what the service is, for instance. But they should be entitled to that. And I think the transparency on blockchain allows markets to be competitive, because that's the other thing. Sometimes people describe, and I think this is a big topic that we also talk about, how we think Web3 ultimately is going to provide a better form of capitalism, right? But, I think, when people talk about Facebook and they talk about Amazon and Google, they talk about it in a context of what's wrong with capitalism. But actually, when you think about the marketplaces that exist, they're not capitalist at all, because capitalism requires a transparent and open market. Who knows what the algorithm does at Apple or Facebook or Google? Only they do. How do you know that when I'm spending money on advertising, I'm actually getting what I'm paying for? I have no idea. I'm just it's actually like putting money into a slot machine and hoping that I will get the right customer and trusting somehow that Apple or Facebook or Google will give me the right customer. And here's the thing. When I advertise, most people will tell you that their return rate is pretty awful, right? And actually a bad return rate is good revenue for the platforms that are selling it to you. So the incentives are completely misaligned, right? These things need to be more transparent so we can have an actual market where third parties can compete, right? And I think the fact that there's no competition actually means to me that the platforms in Web 2 are actually completely anti-capitalist, right? In the sense that they control everything, right? And I think, again, in Web 3, because it's all on-chain, the transparency actually creates a true market.
You mentioned NFTs as well, and I want to ask you more specifically about this vertical. They were the kind of the big breakout use case of the last bull run, and then they really died off in last year. I'm wondering if you think NFTs will look differently this time around in this next cycle. Like, what has the market and builders learned from the past cycle, and how do you think that will produce potentially different use cases for NFTs, different models, or we will keep using them as collectibles, PFPs, kind of the use cases that we saw really break out?
When we think about sort of what does it mean when you have ownership of these NFTs, I think the audiences who buy them actually makes a difference as well. Because in 21 and 22, the speculation of that was actually high for a reason, because most of the people in Web3 3 years ago were actually mostly speculative. And the reason why they were speculative is because they came from the fungible token narratives originally, meaning that, the origins of crypto and sort of, I guess the origins of sort of, tokens and tokenization had a very sort of financial root, right? So it attracted people from the finance world, right? I like to sometimes sort of describe it a little bit as like sort of crypto Wall Street, right? And those people sort of entered the space, and then they saw that they could actually do things with NFTs, maybe even more efficiently in terms of making money than they could with fungible tokens. they kind of took over the narratives. That's not to say that the gaming projects or, Metaverse land projects like Sandbox or, basically collectibles necessarily wanted those type of customers. They just ended up being the majority of that ecosystem at the time. And when the bear happened, they all disappeared, right? And so actually what's happened during the bear, very similar to our experience in 2018, 2019, the people who started buying NFTs and the people who started getting into the space entered for different reasons. The NFT itself has evolved, but even if it didn't, they bought it for much more cultural reasons, right? And they bought it for much more sort of reasons that mattered to them. And I often give this example of sort of cultural meaning behind sort of, objects like that culture, right? Which is, to me, NFTs are stores of culture, digital stores of culture. In the real world, culture has the deepest TVL of any economy. If a country does not have culture or cannot sell culture, it won't have much of an economy. I mean, think about, and when I say culture, I don't mean music or art. I mean fashion, I mean clothes, I mean our houses, I mean the watches, like everything we purchase. Because we decide to purchase things not only because we think we can sell them. Most of us buy things because it says something about who we are, right? As I said earlier, you don't buy a Rolex to tell the time, nor do you buy a Ferrari because you can transport yourself from point A to point B, right? You buy these things to signal something about who you are, and you don't buy to sell because it's a membership, right? So today I would argue that if you own a Bored Ape, maybe it's nice that the value goes up, but you're really buying it because you want to be part of a member of something. You believe in the network that it represents, and you create friendships, or it's and you notice this, right? When someone sells their NFTs from a collection, they always have to almost apologize. They're like, oh, I gotta, my grandma needs some help, or my kids have to go to school. And that's okay, right? Nobody will necessarily critique you, but they somehow feel compelled because it's basically leaving a community. It's much deeper. But when you sell fungible tokens, you don't have that, right? Like if someone sells a bunch of Pepe, it's like, okay, I sold some Pepe and, it's fine. It's traded because it's somehow viewed as a little bit like currency. Some people do that, but in NFTs, it's much more because they're also non-fungible. Once you sell the NFT, everyone knows you sold your NFT. It's like saying you left the country. It's like you sold your house and you moved away, right? And you have to somehow explain it. And that's what I mean about the cultural power in the context of NFTs, because they represent that cultural value, which is so personal to us, to our identities, much more deeply. I would argue that almost everything we invest and purchase in our personal lives actually is mostly to do about our identity, right? And in video gaming, for instance, $100 billion is spent on skins and trinkets that are not actually sort of do anything. They don't make you faster. They don't make you fight better. They just make you look cooler. Right? And so that's the point, right? Again, we already do this in the virtual world. We do this in the physical world. And with NFTs, we basically just get to amplify these values. But then why would I keep this NFT? Because now that I'm a member, people will give me stuff because I'm part of that membership, whether it's the social exclusivity or the social connection, right? So I go back to this whole thing. NFTs in themselves are social networks, right? And people can build social networks on top of it. Like I totally expect that people will build social networks based on sort of certain NFT collections or many NFT collections because they bind you together, right? Because it's a commitment. And it's like, when I go to a Facebook page of, let's call it, I don't know, Mercedes owners, right? Or any brand, name the brand. There's probably only 1 or 2% of the people who are following that page that actually own it, right? The vast majority actually are just, sort of casual visitors or maybe fans of it. But in NFTs, you can absolutely tell who owns it. And therefore, you can offer them that direct value, which is, of course, better for the advertiser, better for the brand, and better for the owner because he now receives a direct benefit because he's directly being targeted for actual valuable services, right? So I think this is what's changing. And like in Mocaverse, for instance, our NFT collection, we only have less than maybe 0.5% that is now being sold on the market, right? Whereas maybe 2 years ago or 3 years ago, maybe more than half of the collection would have been up in the market because the audience has changed, right? In the last 1.5 to 2 years, at least in Asia, most people came into Web3 because of NFTs, because of culture. But, 5 or 6 years ago, most people joined Web3 because they wanted to have Bitcoin, because they wanted to have sort of financial value, shall we say, right? And so that to me is kind of the evolution. I'll close it with another thought here, which is, money, of course, is relevant. But I think for most people, certainly we think of it this way, money is a means to a social end, a sort of cultural end, shall we say. It's not a means in itself. There's some people where money is the end in itself. But for most people, you use money to get something that's important for you, right? Whether it's tuition for your children, whether it's a house for your family, whether it's a nice ring, whether you want to get married, right? That's what you use money for, right? You don't care for money in and of itself as much, right? And I think that human translation will work just the same way in the open metaverse, right? And we want to represent ourselves just the same way in the metaverse as we do in the physical world.
Are you ready to revolutionize how you interact with live content? Introducing PlayFi, where AI meets blockchain to unlock real-time data from live streams, sports, and more. With PlayFi, creators and brands can monetize and engage like never before. Join the future of live content. Visit playfi.ai today and discover how you can power the next era of play. Okay, so you're saying that after last year's bear, a lot of the speculators and people who were in it, just for the money and not for the culture, left as the market tanked. And so does that mean that right now, the people who have been trading NFTs are in it for quote unquote, I don't know if like the right reasons is the way to say it, but at least for, they actually want to belong to these networks. Like they appreciate these NFTs for the things that they say about them. And it's a group of people who, are not always in it because they just want to flip them and,
Correct.
Make quick gains.
Correct. And just to be clear, when the market is accelerating again, the speculators do come back, right? Because obviously when there's money,
we're already seeing that.
Yeah, we're seeing that already. So you have a mixture of that. But the difference is that the ratio of that mixture is not as sort of wildly speculative as it used to be, right? Because of the fact that you now have a bigger holder base, right? That is not speculative in nature. Because when the market actually tanked, and this is no different when you talk about sort of, let's say, holding Bitcoin, right? When the market tanks, there's an opportunity for people to actually enter the space and to buy it at a price point that isn't, that ridiculous. I mean, one could argue, for instance, that sure, maybe the value in ETH of, an NFT like a Bored Ape has dropped. But actually, the value of the token, as in Ethereum, was also much lower and therefore much more affordable in comparison to today. Even if the price in ETH wasn't that high, the price in, let's call it dollars, is much higher because the value of ETH is, basically literally three times higher than it was, a year or a year and a half ago, for instance, right? So it's all these factors that come in. And then, it's, again, I see it a little bit like owning property in the physical world. If you own a home and it means something to you, you don't immediately think of making a profit. You have to think, okay, if I sell this home, then I need to buy another home somewhere, right? And I need to move somewhere else. These are elements as well, because it's not just about sort of the utility of living. Because, if you want to live somewhere, you can live many places in the world much cheaper, right? You don't have to, right?
Tell me about it here in Brooklyn.
Yeah, exactly, right? I mean, so the physicality, the actual space itself isn't what's really valuable. It's the vicinity. It's, you live in Brooklyn or you live in Manhattan. What you're actually choosing to live in is the network effects that you get from living in that area, whether it's status, whether it's connections, whether it's, all other things, direct or indirect, right? And again, the same is true for NFTs.
Super interesting. And then last topic as we wrap up, Metaverse. You've been obviously very big on the Metaverse, and it seemed like this very hyped up term last cycle that maybe didn't live up to its, full promise. So, as we're still kind of in the beginning of 2024, how do you think the Metaverse is going to develop this year?
So to us, the metaverse is kind of, or what we call the open metaverse, because we do want to make a distinction between, the Web2 closed metaverses versus the open metaverses that are building on blockchain. The foundation is digital property rights, right? If you own something, then this metaverse is meaningful for you, right? And I think we're already seeing this expand in quite a significant manner. I think led through gaming, as we've seen in the Philippines and in Asia, but broadly speaking, I think will expand. I don't think of the metaverse as things like what you can do with VR, AR. To me, those are interfaces into the metaverse. They allow you a way to experience it, maybe in a more richer way. But it's, again, it has no meaning unless you own a piece of that. So to me, when I say open metaverse, and I think that's part of the struggle, because so many people have a different idea of what metaverse means sometimes, that we can't come to a common agreement. So maybe we even need a new term. But for the time being, the way that we would define the open metaverse is everything that's related to Web3. So for instance, to me, DeFi is the banking of the metaverse, right? I mean, if it wasn't for DeFi summer, then Web3 gaming wouldn't have accelerated, and NFTs wouldn't have the kind of value that they have because you had these public sort of, open financial rails attached to it. One of the things, I go back to this thing about network effects, right? The open metaverse is built on top of the ability for others to compound network effects on top of each other. And in Web3, because it's built on blockchain, the transactional nature is tied in with the financial nature right in the same system. In Web2, if I was selling you a video game skin, or if I was selling you even a physical item or some product, actually I had to sort of plug in this very clumsy third-party interface to give it a financial layer, whether it's a PayPal API or Stripe or whatever, right? They do a good job, but they only do a small part of the financial transaction, right? They don't do sort of because it's not embedded within it. But in blockchain, that financial system is part and parcel of the entire transaction. So it allows for a whole bunch of new innovation and consequently more network effects to build on top of it, right? So I look at that, right, and I say, okay, the DeFi banking system essentially is the public bank of the metaverse. And then DAOs, for instance, to me represent companies in the metaverse, right? I mean, they're community run mostly, right? And 1 year ago, I gave a TED talk on this, and I was talking about how DAOs had $12 billion in their treasuries, which at the time seemed like a pretty big figure. And the last figure today actually is over $42 billion, for instance, right? And that figure is amazing because again, that $42 billion is not owned by a single corporation. It's not run by sort of, a VC. It's run by a community who votes as to how it should be spent, right? Whether it's an L1, L2, whether it's like ApeCoin, sort of a cultural token, it doesn't really matter. The point is that you have entire ecosystems sprung from it. And then people are making a livelihood from this, and they're making incomes from this, and they're building products and services on this. So I think of the open metaverse as everything that we see on Web3 and blockchain. And to me, it's like this new promised land, right? I grew up in Europe as an immigrant Chinese family, like many, many decades ago. I won't say how long, so I don't have to reveal how old I really am. But the place that we really all wanted to go to was America. Right? America was the promised land because you had freedom, you had liberty. Coming from Asia, most people probably don't even know that, 40 years ago, South Korea had a GDP that was lower than North Korea, right? And China was really, frankly speaking, a mess. Right. So in our living history over the last 30, 40 years, China has now become, basically the second largest economy in the world. And Korea is the 12th largest sort of economy in the world, way ahead of North Korea, for instance. Right. And so those are examples of what happens when, you have property rights and when you have these kind of sort of effects come together.
That means that your definition of the metaverse is basically like everything that happens on chain? Is that
yes?
A right way to see it?
I guess it's everything that happens on chain, and to be viewed basically like a new country, right? And when you go to Web3, it's like you're immigrating to Web3. It's like you're going to America 30, 40 years ago for new opportunity, for new prospects, for new hope, right? You don't have to go to space. You don't have to go to Mars. You can just go to the open metaverse.
Very cool. I like that framing. Cool. And then to wrap up, like what are you excited for to be built in this new country that we're all immigrating to?
Yeah. So, one of the really exciting things is that, for instance, I'm super excited about DAOs, not because, and I think this is the other thing, a lot of people are critical of DAOs, right? They say it's not working, ApeCoin is a failure. But, it's still a $2 billion plus DAO and funding and entirely democratic setup, which is run by communities that are voted into it. And we have many examples of other DAOs like this. And my point on this is that, in the case of democratic systems, is that, you have to innovate on democracy. And I think we can never fully sort of get to, like if you have always an agreement, then it's probably not a democracy, right? Like the fact that, and I mean, this is the thing as well, like the consensus mechanisms in blockchain may seem slower and less efficient than, a centralized system for very obvious reasons. But it's because it's slower, because there is a consensus, that we can be secured and that we can know that there is value in our assets. I mean, that's the reason why countries like America, despite the fact that it may seem a little messy as a democratic system, has a higher PE, has a higher value, because you can be assured that your property rights can never be taken away. Versus, you can go to a country that has a lot of, efficiency, but just as efficient as they can be to give you value, they can take it away, and therefore they trade at discounts, and they're not as valuable as a result, right? So we see those same parameters. So that's one area where we think DAOs allow us to iterate in democratic systems, but at the rate of technology. Because you can't actually sort of innovate in democratic systems in the real world very easily, because you do that in a country and you mess up, it has pretty big consequences, right? And we also don't get to practice democratic principles a lot in real life. And I think DAOs allow us to do this on a regular basis. Like you can vote on something every week or every other week, because in real life, where do you really get to practice your democratic system? I mean, most of work isn't very democratic. When you go to school, it's not very democratic. Maybe your family isn't very democratic, right? I mean, we can go all sorts of levels to have a conversation as to what that means, right? So how do we understand and build sort of this dialogue about sort of, I guess, consensus? But I think the other thing that I'm really excited about is, when you become a true Web3 user, you become also more financially literate. I think that's been the struggle when you go from Web2 to Web3. Like in Web, we've onboarded a lot of Web2 gamers to Web3, but they don't do anything that is Web3 because they don't understand money. They don't understand investing. And we're not asking them to become investors per se, but they do have to understand the value of things and why it matters, because we don't teach that in school, right? And I think most people have a relationship with money that's pretty bad because they have student debt, and it feels like indentured servitude. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why in the West, for instance, crypto, in particular NFT gaming, has had a pretty negative reputation, because it actually introduces these elements of capitalism, which feels sort of negative to them, right? In the same way that they feel hostile to Wall Street bankers, they feel hostile towards crypto people, because it feels sort of alien and kind of unfair. Whereas in Asia, for instance, it's much more accepted, not just on the government level like Hong Kong or basically Japan and so on, but also because the people themselves remember a time when they had no property rights. Like my parents didn't have that, for instance, right? We could lose anything anytime. And so we appreciate capitalism. We appreciate what property rights have given us. And so if we appreciate the meaning behind digital property rights in the same way that it means for us in physical property rights, right? So I think that education comes from learning about financial systems better. And I think when we successfully onboard a Web2 user to Web3, we make them financially literate. And that, to me, I think, changes the dynamics, because if we can teach our children sort of algebra and math, and we can certainly teach them compound interest, and we can certainly teach them financial systems aren't really that hard. I mean, my kids have to study sort of derivatives and calculus. That's much harder. That's much harder than most of the economic principles that we need to know about how to sort of balance our books and understand around investments. And then imagine a world where maybe most of us have financial literacy, kind of like how we can read and write, right? What would the world look like? Well, first of all, there would be a lot less financial scams, because you can't scam people when they know what they're doing, right? The rules around protecting people around, I guess, financial sort of protection would be very different, because we would all be much more informed. I think it also creates more inclusivity as a result. We would understand why we need to have capital, why labor isn't that valuable anymore, right? I mean, when you think about the future of AI, right? Most of the classic ideas of labor is dead, right? Because we're not going to be making money from classic labor. So that means we have to become involved in capital, which means we have to kind of all sort of become investors of some sort, or hold equity or hold assets, which I think in Web3, because, through token ownership, you basically have ownerships in the networks you construct, right? So this to me is kind of the great future that I think can sort of shape humanity and give us much more hope and opportunity. Because today it's very difficult for most people to own a stake in anything, because a house is expensive and most other assets are really not really assets in the classic sense. You can't become a shareholder in the network that is Instagram, even though you contribute to it, right? It's not possible to do that. But in Web3, you can do that. So that to me is, I think, the potentially great promise of Web3 to create basically a more fair, inclusive society, this new country.
It's a huge and very inspiring vision for sure. And, we at the Defiant, we hope to play a role in bringing that, education for people, kind of making sure that they understand that first of all, there is this brand new world out there and how to use it, how to leverage it. But I think it will come organically, as these Web3 native apps become more and more popular. People will start to, understand from using these apps the power of being an owner of the app itself, but also of your own data, the power of holding your own assets, your own information, leveraging them, being able to move that from one app to another app, not being stuck in these closed gardens. I'm really optimistic that this will soon become evident to the mainstream. Hopefully, sooner rather than later. Yat, it was so great talking. Thank you so much for taking the time. Love to learn about what you're building, your vision. Super interesting views on Web3, NFTs, and so on. So thanks again.
Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.